Alright, classes here again in my basement. So building on some of the stuff we talked about, well, we didn't talk about, I talked about it, and you contributed on the discussion board. Hopefully, if you didn't contribute on the discussion board, still trying to work on the lighting here. So building on some of that personhood stuff we talked about, then what does that have to say about our interactions with animals? And so here are some topics that I'd like for you to comment on the discussion board. You don't have to comment on all of them necessarily, but just kind of be thinking about all of them and then comment on the ones that you choose to. Zoos. Are zoos ethical? And I mean a good zoo. I mean the type of zoo that actually takes care of the animals. I don't mean one that mistreats the animals. I mean the very concept of a zoo, to take animals from their natural habitat, to then put them in another location for people to come and observe, learn from. I mean, there's an educational piece to this. And frequently they give them room, but not as much room as they would have out in nature, right? So I'm thinking of the Columbus Zoo, which is considered to be one of the better zoos in the country, if not the world. Are animals happy? I don't know how you determine happiness with an animal. They're well fed. They don't have to fight for food. Is that good or bad? I don't know. The Wilds, out in Zanesville, affiliated with the zoo, right? Gives much more space for the giraffes and so forth. But of course, giraffes are not indigenous to Zanesville, Ohio. I think about Franklin Park Conservatory for the butterfly exhibition. Butterflies literally from all over the world, primarily from Central and South America, but from all over the world, in Columbus, indoors. They cannot mate. Well, they can mate, but they cannot actually lay their eggs because, according to the U.S. Government, the butterflies are pests because they're an invasive species, so they cannot leave the conservatory. They also then cannot procreate. So they can mate, but they can't actually lay any eggs because of the plants and so forth that are in there. It's very strict, stringent guidelines. So they eat and they procreate, and then they die, but they also never leave that room of the conservatory. Does that matter? I don't know. Really interesting book, The One and Only Ivan, which if you haven't read it, highly recommend it. Has a lot to say about animals and about art. And in there it says that zoos are a way that people make amends. It's an interesting concept too. Sorry as I keep messing with the light here. Still trying to get the lighting in the basement right here for videos. And then kind of related to that zoo idea then, what about pets? Is it ethical to have pets? I mean, my family and I had long discussions about the ethics of pet ownership. Pet ownership. Notice we're owning a living being. That's odd. I guess now the language has changed to pet adoption. But still, how much say does the pet really have, if any? Right? And then of course there's that line between which pets are okay to have as pets, which pets are not, right? Cats and dogs and birds and fish, okay. Lions, tigers, bears, crocodiles, not okay. Does the ethics change, or merely the law that's different? Interesting to consider. Is my house merely a more localized zoo for the 2 cats that we eventually did adopt? So, I don't know, I'm kind of weird. You guys probably already knew that. So of course even things like, hey, should we have cats, became quite the discussion. My kids, of course, wanted pets. Pets are awesome, will teach us responsibility and so on and so forth, more living creatures around. My wife said, you know, be good for their mental health as they develop and grow, right, to have something soft that they can pet, someone that they can talk to who's not going to judge and talk back, so on and so forth. I just don't know if it's okay to keep them in captivity, if there should be free-range cats instead, right? That maybe we put out some milk or something and feed them. Then that raises the question of, are they our pets then? If we feed them, what's a pet? What's not a pet? But that's more a question I ask with the elementary schoolers. So yeah, pets. And what about food, right? There's that weird distinction too between, yeah, we would have here in the United States at least, usually we would have dogs and cats as pets. We would not consider them to be food. Other cultures around the world, dogs are food. And so why does that strike us as odd? Is it merely a cultural thing, or is there something more deeply ethical going on here? Perhaps it goes back to the personhood thing. Dogs are more person-like. Dolphins more person-like, so we don't eat them. Cows, more like cabbage. Pigs, more like cabbage. Maybe. I don't know. Right? These are open questions. These are the questions for discussion. And when it comes to the food aspect, right, is there an ethical difference between, say, for instance, free-range chickens versus the factory farm chickens? The chickens who are grass and grain fed versus the ones that are pumped full of hormones and forced to eat their own kind as cannibals. I don't know. I mean, on one hand, people want to say that the free range is more ethical because it's an ethical way to treat the animal before you slaughter them and eat them. But on the other hand, I wonder, right, is that actually less ethical because here's an animal which was free, you're now taking its freedom from it to then slaughter it and eat it, versus the animals that don't know any different. Perhaps it goes back to the zoo stuff as well, right? These butterflies in the conservatory don't know any different. It's not as if they were captured in Costa Rica and then sent to the conservatory. It's like, whoa, why am I in this room now? No, they're sent to the conservatory as chrysalis. They've literally never been a butterfly out in freedom. Is that ethically better? Ethically worse? Ethically the same as? I don't know. Are animals here merely for our use? Right? Is it ethical to use the horse or the oxen to plow the fields? Or is the more ethical choice to use machines instead? And back to the food thing again, what about the genetic modification, right? We genetically modify fruits and vegetables. Should we, ethically again, be genetically modifying animals to make them tastier? Not just injecting them with hormones, but going in and manipulating the DNA itself. There are a couple of companies now, Memphis Meats, based in San Francisco, not Memphis, but whatever, among others that are taking the cells from particular animals and then kind of recreating in a scientific environment, in a petri dish and whatnot, an entire chicken breast, for instance, so that you're not necessarily having to kill multiple chickens. You just merely need the cells, and then you can recreate those in a lab to then provide the chicken eating wants of people without having to slaughter more chickens. Are sheep here merely for us to shear for wool? That also then raises an interesting question with regards to testing on animals. Drug testing on animals? I don't know. What's the alternative? Test on people? Which eventually you have to test on people anyway. What about all these science experiments and so forth with things like lab rats and whatnot? Is that ethical? Right? Oh wow, gee, this is an interesting thing that occurred when we injected this particular rat with a particular thing. Or, oh gee, look, we can grow a human ear on the back of a rat. Isn't that fascinating? Now we can grow organs and so forth. Is that an ethical use of rats and mice? Makeup testing. Is it ethical to the rabbit? Do we have ethical responsibilities to animals at all? Which is really what a lot of this is getting to. Right? Should we all be vegetarian, for instance? Or vegan, even? I don't know, bacon's pretty delicious. Back to the testing then, right? The makeup thing. If we don't test the makeup on animals, then how do we know how it may react and respond when people apply it? Or maybe it's unethical to wear makeup. We'll talk about that next time. What about hunting of animals? Right? And is there an ethical difference between hunting, say, deer or turkey, which may otherwise overpopulate, versus the safari hunts for lions and elephants and so forth? You also have the economic impact, right? The The safari hunts, sometimes the revenue that generates supports perhaps the animal refugee location that's affiliated. Perhaps it spurs the local economy of that entire city or village or town or township, or who knows how far-reaching these economic ramifications could be. And should economics matter at all with regards to ethics anyway? Utilitarianism, of course, says yes. Deontology would be like, no. Care ethics may say, no. How much should we care that polar bear is stranded out on the ice cap? How much should we really care about that poor three-legged dog? I don't know. What about bullfighting? I mean, if hunting is ethically okay, and I'm talking about hunting for game, not necessarily hunting for food. Those may be separate issues as well. Hunting for food versus hunting just for sport. Right? Humans are one of only 2 species, I think this is correct, I think my source is right on this, one of only 2 species in the world that hunt purely for sport, that hunt not just for protection or for food. Wolverines are the other one. And if so, if it's okay to hunt merely for sport, right, trophy hunting or something along those lines, is it ethically okay to fight bulls as well? Is that part of their purpose, part of the usage that we get out of bulls? I mean, there's an art to it, right? It's very popular and has been for a long, long time in certain parts of the world. And when I think about bullfighting, then I think about, is that akin to the gladiator fights from thousands of years ago, right, where certain individuals, typically prisoners, would be put into a ring with tigers or what have you to fight to the death. Typically, the things like tigers won. Of course, that wasn't voluntary. Are the bulls really volunteering for this either? Do we need consent from the animals? What would that look like? Maybe some rabbits are okay being tested on. Perhaps some bulls are okay being in a ring, right? Because sometimes the bull wins. I don't know. Then when I think about the bullfighting and the voluntary versus involuntary, and gladiators and whatnot, then I think, well, first of all, about Thor Ragnarok and Hulk and all of that stuff, where these gladiators can sometimes rise to prominence. And then it also reminds me of United States football, for instance. Right? These individuals, these men, voluntarily go into a profession that could have lifelong debilitating effects on their body. They know the trade-off, it's for potentially millions of dollars. Is football itself ethical then? Knowing what could potentially happen? And of course I realize servicemen sign up for something potentially debilitating or that could lead to their death, as do firefighters and police officers. Those jobs may be a bit different than a sport. Perhaps like hunting for sport versus hunting for food. Also raises another interesting question as far as our relationship to animals. And this really goes back to this science testing and whatnot. This is an article from National Geographic from, let's see, 2013, so quite a while ago now. And I don't know if progress has been made on this. I think the more interesting ethical issue is, should we continue down this path? And this is known as de-extinction. Bringing them back to life. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will read the first part to kind of set up the discussion to then follow, hopefully. On July 30th, 2003, so even further in the past, a team of Spanish and French scientists reversed time. They brought an animal back from extinction, if only to watch it become extinct again. The animal they revived was a kind of wild goat known as a bucardo, or Pyrenean ibex. The bucardo was a large, handsome creature, reaching up to 220 pounds and sporting long, gently curved horns. For thousands of years it lived high in the Pyrenees, where it clambered along cliffs, nibbling on leaves and stems and enduring harsh winters. Then came the guns. Hunters drove down the bucardo population over several centuries. In 1989, Spanish scientists did a survey and concluded that there were only a dozen or so individuals left. 10 years later, a single bucardo remained, a female nicknamed Celia. A team from the Ordesa y Monte Perdido National Park, led by wildlife vet Alberto Fernandez, caught the animal in a trap, clipped a radio collar around her neck, and released her back into the wild. 9 months later, the radio collar let out a long, steady beep, the signal that Celia had died. They found her crushed beneath a fallen tree. With her death, the bucardo became officially extinct. But Celia's cells lived on, preserved in labs in Zaragoza and Madrid. Over the next few years, a team of reproductive physiologists led by José Folch injected nuclei from those cells into goat eggs emptied of their own DNA, then implanted the eggs in surrogate mothers. After 57 implantations, only 7 animals became pregnant. And of those 7, 6 ended in miscarriages. But one mother, a hybrid between a Spanish ibex and a goat, carried a clone of Celia to term. Folch and his colleagues performed a cesarean section and delivered the 4.5-pound clone. As Fernandez held the newborn bucardo in his arms, he could see that she was struggling to take in air, her tongue jutting grotesquely out of her mouth. Despite the efforts to help her breathe, after a mere 10 minutes, Celia's clone died. And necropsy later revealed that one of her lungs had grown a gigantic extra lobe as solid as a piece of liver. There was nothing anyone could have done. So the question is, should we continue down this path? Should we go down the path of de-extinction? One person quoted in the article, Michael Archer, a paleontologist at the University of New South Wales, has championed de-extinction for years. He says, if we're talking about species that we drove extinct, I think we have an obligation to try to do this. That we're ethically on the hook for the fact that they're extinct, therefore we're ethically on the hook for trying to bring them back if we can. We're the reason they're gone. We should try to correct that if possible. And some people then protest, saying that reviving a species that no longer exists amounts to playing God. Archer says, I think we played God when we exterminated these animals. Right? That maybe natural selection isn't the case anymore, that since we've inserted ourselves, this is now some type of unnatural selection. Or we're part of nature too, perhaps this is still natural selection. That's a slightly different topic, the distinction between natural and artificial. A topic which we'll probably touch on again next time with regards to biomedical ethics. But Archer here raises an interesting question then. First of all, are we ethically responsible for bringing back the bucardo, for instance? We're the reason they're gone. And then every time I read this in class, someone brings up Jurassic Park. Okay. Are we then also obligated to bring back species that we didn't cause their extinction? Because we can. Think of the scientific advancements and so forth. So here, kind of, I'm asking the Jeff Goldblum question from the original Jurassic Park, before it's too late, before we've already made the decision. I'm trying to stop and ask if this is something we should do, rather than asking it after we've discovered we can and have already done it. And I think really the interesting ethical question, too, with regards to Jurassic Park is in the latest installment at the very beginning, where the island is being destroyed, whatever's happening, I forget exactly, right? But these dinosaurs, which we brought back, are now faced with possible extinction again. And so the question, the ethical debate at the beginning is, are we responsible now for them since we brought them back? Or is this kind of nature correcting itself? Complicated stuff. And again, remember too, if you're thinking about Jurassic Park, and you're thinking about the ethics of this de-extinction thing, Jurassic Park, in the movie, the theme park did not fail because we brought dinosaurs back. It failed, again, this is business ethics, it failed because there weren't enough measures in place to prevent things like sabotage. There was only one employee, Wayne Knight character, who knew the safety stuff. Nobody was cross-trained, and then he wasn't compensated what he thought was fairly, so then he sold out the company. I don't know that everything else that happens in that movie necessarily happens just because we brought dinosaurs back. And again, even in the newer installments, not the latest one, but the one before that, I forget what it's called, Jurassic World, maybe? I don't know, whatever it's called. The first one with Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard and all of them. Even in that one, everything was fine until they started going the next step with the genetic manipulation, right? The Indominus Rex, right? Well, regular dinosaurs aren't fancy enough. We're not bringing in the people like we need to. So let's create something else which never existed before. All the other dinosaurs existed before. We merely brought them back. Now we're creating something anew. That may be a different ethical question as well. And that ties us right back into the zoos. Zoos, as far as tax purposes go, are nonprofit organizations. They are service first rather than profit. But of course they do charge things like admission in order to be able to pay employees and whatnot. Is a zoo like the Jurassic Park amusement thing? Or is a zoo something different than that? Is the idea of Jurassic Park the idea of a zoo such that it's there primarily for educational purposes? Because let's call it what it is. My kids and I are not heading to China anytime soon to see any pandas. We may go to the Columbus Zoo to see pandas. We may go to the wilds to see giraffes. We're not going to where the giraffes are. We're going only if the giraffes are close to where we are. And that experience may be something which one of my kids gets inspired by, and they decide to go into something to do with zoology or big animal veterinary or some type of conservation effort around the world to save the panda or save the polar bear or save the who knows what. I'm not giving you any answers here on purpose. I'm just presenting tons and tons of questions that deal with the ethics of animals and how we interact with them. And again, feel free to reference some of that personhood stuff from last time, because it does seem we would treat persons differently than we would treat animals. Right? We wouldn't eat Cousin Jimmy just because he's brain dead, and therefore is not capable of reasoning in the same capacity that we are, even if at one time he was. Except in dire situations, humans have turned to cannibalism for survival. Was that ethical or not? I don't know. Alright, so please go back to the discussion boards and the forums and weigh in on some of these. I'll start the discussion with a link again to the YouTube channel, in this video and so forth, and then just reply to that so that we can all reply to each other, so that these are all kind of in the same thread, so that everyone has an idea what everyone else is saying, so it's more like a discussion. Thanks.